My name's Nathan Chapman. I'm the CTO at Generation E. I spent a lot of my time talking to customers about their communication strategy and their business requirements. And then I work with Generation E to deliver solutions around that, around Skype for Business and the partner ecosystem to deliver end-to-end on those solutions. So in this session, I'm going to talk about largely around the transition strategy for deploying Skype for Business, or potentially even upgrading to Skype for Business if you're using earlier versions. And again, you'll see there's a bit of a focus on enabling what we call enterprise voice. And if you're not familiar with the term enterprise voice in a Microsoft language, means using Skype for Business as a telephone system and ultimately being able to replace any legacy phone systems. Now that doesn't necessarily happen overnight, so there's quite a lot of interop and transition that we'll talk to. Just to give you a sense of, I guess, the common workloads that we talk about in Skype for Business, and also relating it maybe back to your licensing as well, which you'll see across the bottom of these slides. First of all is the idea of instant messaging and presence, and that's what most people would associate with early versions of Skype for Business. And peer-to-peer audio and video, the idea of federation, so being able to use all these communications tools to federate with other organizations. Also, there's the idea of persistent chat as well. It's been another feature that's been around for a number of versions. So this is a pretty quick and easy bit of functionality to get up and running. And today you have the choice of doing that in Office 365 as an online service, or by deploying infrastructure within your environment or within a partner data center to deliver this. And again, from a licensing point of view, this is what the standard CAL is about for Skype for Business. To get that up and running internally, at least, it's a front-end server or a front-end server pool. Typically, that we'd also add what we call an edge server here, which extends all that functionality to the outside of your organization for your remote users that are seamlessly roaming and connecting and consuming that service, but also to federate to other organizations, and also for meeting guests as well. So if you want to invite other people into these link, I said it, Skype for Business meetings. If you want to invite other people into these experiences that don't have Skype for Business, they can join via a web interface and have that full functionality with high definition audio and video. No, it's back. So the next workload that we would add is these meetings. So this Skype meetings. And again, you've got the option to deploy these today in the online space, so use this as an online service with Office 365 or as part of your on-premise infrastructure. And this is where it really starts to get interesting, is we're using link meetings to collaborate, again, both internally and also now integrating existing investments in video conferencing infrastructure. We're seeing a lot of organizations fitting out meeting spaces for native Skype communications, and we're going to talk a bit more to that later this afternoon. So when you're getting into Skype for Business meetings, so I only got $5 in my pocket. I think it was $2 a time, so I'll have to break a 50 soon. When you're getting into these meetings, we start to deliver a lot more value. And again, from a licensing point of view, I was touched on that. This is where we get to enterprise CAL, or in Office 365 terms, it's still part of the E1, E3, E4 SKUs. So after we're starting using meetings within your organization, again, internal and external collaboration, that's all great. The next step is often PSTN dial-in conferencing. So it's great to be able to have a collaboration with someone and join from your PC or perhaps from a meeting room device. But there's still cases where you just want to be able to dial in from a telephone. So PSTN dial-in conferencing is an extension of Skype meetings where you can bring in audio participants just from any ordinary telephone. To do that, we need some infrastructure to connect some phone lines. So at this point today, we've got a couple of options. We can do this in the Skype for Business online service. We do that through a service called Audio Conferencing Provider. So that's where you would pay a conferencing provider in addition to your Office 365 service, and that those two services connect together to bring audio participants into your Skype for Business meetings that are hosted in Microsoft Cloud. First, I don't see a lot of uptake of this for the customers we're talking to, and I think that's probably because a lot of the time the reasons people are moving towards Skype meetings is because there is a big return on investment opportunity around consolidating a lot of those legacy conferencing tools. So if you can get to this world where you've got one tool that meets all your real-time communications and meeting needs, then you don't need to pay another provider to do that. So that service is available, and again, it can be used as a good way to bridge that transition. But what we're seeing probably a bit more of today is this on-premise integration with the PSTN or with the existing phone system. So I'm going to talk through a bit later about some recommended options and how we do that. So at this point here, we're starting to talk about on-premise deployment. So we can't integrate with your own phone lines yet through Skype for Business as an online service. So the last workload is enterprise voice, and I said together with that it's PBX interop. So again, while the vision I talk about with our customers is about getting to the full workloads and having that one experience across all the different modalities, from an instant message to a telephone call to a meeting. Customers have a lot of investment in existing infrastructure, and that can take time to transition off. So we recognize that, and we have a number of strategies to be able to do that easily and see through investments that you may already have. And again, in licensing terms, this is what's included in the Plus CAL or in the E4 Office 365 CAL if you're talking about licensing. So I just want to give you a little bit of a sense of what an architecture looks like for a Skype for Business deployment. First of all, we've got some existing infrastructure that most of you will probably already have. It needs Active Directory for an on-premise deployment. We use certificates a lot in Skype for Business. It's part of the inherent secure nature of Skype for Business. Everything is encrypted by default, both media and audio and the signaling as well. So we use certificates for that, and internally we typically use an internal certificate authority, so you don't have to pay money for public certificates everywhere. There's an Office Web App Service. This is really used for rendering PowerPoint presentations. This feature of Office Web Apps, it's kind of part of the SharePoint platform, but it's to use the feature in how Skype for Business uses it. If you don't have that role, you can deploy that without having to buy any SharePoint licensing. It's a role that you can use without having to buy all the other licenses. Skype for Business uses SQL as well. Depending on whether you're doing an enterprise or standard edition architecture, you'll use it for different things. But at a minimum, we would use it for monitoring and logging, which is something that we basically insist that our customers deploy to have that visibility of what's happening, how the tool's running, how users are using it from adoption, but it's also a really useful troubleshooting tool as well. In enterprise architectures, the configuration and information about the Skype for Business deployment is also stored in a SQL backend, and Val touched on one of the new options around always-on availability for that as well. Also, we integrate with Exchange. So Exchange is the non-real-time part of UC. So things like email, even if you're integrating faxes into there, and voicemail. These are communications that are not natively real-time. So you communicate, you wait for someone to receive that message and respond to you. But as opposed to everything in Skype for Business, where everything is real-time, it's audio, it's video, it's instant messaging and presence, and meetings where you actually engage with someone in real-time. So on top of that existing infrastructure, this is where we start adding in Skype for Business. So the architecture revolves around a front-end server or a pool of front-end servers. So a pool in Microsoft terms and Skype for Business terms is a logical group of servers for high availability. With this one server deployment, we can enable all that first workload we talked about, instant messaging and presence, and audio, video calling, even the meetings we can do, because all the bridging happens back on this server. So we can deliver a lot of value very quickly just by delivering one server. But typically what happens along with that is we also deploy the Skype for Business Edge and supporting reverse proxy. So again, these roles are really extending all that functionality to your remote users, to your meeting guests, to your mobile devices, and to federated partners, and even federation with the Skype consumer platform as well. The reverse proxy, by the way, it's not technically a Skype for Business role, it's a supporting piece of infrastructure, and it's often something that customers would have in their environment for publishing other web services today. So it just publishes some web components for Skype for Business. The next piece is where we're adding in some connectivity to the PSTN or possibly integration with a PBX. So this is either a gateway or a session border controller. So an SBC is, think of it as a SIP version of a gateway that connects you to SIP services, whereas a gateway is typically connecting you to traditional telephony like ISDN. And also an SBA, which is a survivable branch appliance, which allows you to put a device at a branch that can allow that branch to maintain voice functionality if it loses connectivity back to the core where these front ends are. There's a couple of other roles. Again, this is a very high-level overview. There's a bit more detail we can go into here, but there's a persistent chat role. If you want to deliver persistent chat, which is really, think of it as chat meeting rooms where you can go and have a conversation in there. That's a separate server role that's deployed. In some environments, you can actually deploy it in a smaller case. You can co-locate it on the front end. And also the video interrupt server we'll cover later on as well. Persistent chat, by the way, again, we don't see it deployed a lot because I think Yammer and the other, I guess, enterprise social tools are finding it taking over on a lot of that functionality. A common topic I'm talking to customers about is ISDN versus SIP. So why should I go to SIP trunking, and is there any value in that for me? So I just want to touch on this. This is a traditional model of how a lot of people would do their telephony today across sites. So they probably have ISDN phone lines out to the sites. These boxes represent, in Skype for Business terms, they'd be branch survivable appliances. So they connect to a local phone line. They've got a version of the Skype for Business server running in there that can keep phone calls up and running and those features available. So this is great, gives us site survivability, but there's a lot of infrastructure here to maintain and a lot of line rentals to pay for as well. So there's a significant cost associated with having a decentralized approach to your communications. So what is becoming a lot more popular is moving towards SIP trunking, which allows you to centralize a lot of that infrastructure. So rather than having devices at the branch sites, we put them back in your data centers, typically in 2 for disaster recovery and high availability. So now our calls come in for the external world into your data centers, and from there they're distributed back across your WAN to your branch sites. Inherently, this sacrifices traditional branch survivability because we are relying on your WAN link to get those calls back to your users at your branch sites. However, this is mitigated by the fact that Skype for Business has these seamless mobility and features like simultaneous rings, so that if a call comes in from the outside world and my branch site's WAN link has gone down, they can still receive the call on their mobile phone because they've set their Skype for Business to SIM ring their mobile device. Or they could just tether to their mobile or go home. So there's a number of ways that we can mitigate these scenarios of WAN failures, and rather than the traditional approach of putting more infrastructure out the branch. It's typically what people are trying to avoid. So one of the big considerations around this, when you centralize things, you need to think carefully about your WAN. You're probably going to end up using some more bandwidth, and you need to do some careful planning around that as well. Often what we find is that the savings you might make in a lot of the consolidation of your phone lines, which is probably where there's the biggest opportunity for cost savings and moving to SIP trunks, is often reinvested back into the WAN to give you more bandwidth. And more bandwidth in your WAN is good because it's good for other applications as well. So I'm going to talk about some strategies for how we interop. So assuming you've got an existing PBX or phone voice platform here, this is an approach we call an Upstream Gateway. And it tends to be our preferred approach of how we would start introducing that PSTN dial-in conferencing, or maybe a voice pilot, or a coexistence because you may be moving groups of users across to Skype for Business native enterprise voice. The reason this approach, it suits us as an integrator working with customers, but often also the customers, is that what this device does is we deploy it in between the existing phone system and your incoming phone line. So it sits in line with those phone calls. Initially, when we put it in there, we let the calls just pass through, and the phone system wouldn't know the difference. It's just a bump in the wire along the way. But these devices can talk to Active Directory, and they know when you've enabled a user for Skype for Business Enterprise Voice and you've given them a phone number. So as a call comes through, it looks to see, is this phone number enabled for Skype for Business? If it is, I'm going to send it across here to the Skype for Business server, and that will make your devices ring here, whether it's the PC client or a telephone device or your mobile device. So we can dynamically start redirecting calls. And so this means that we can migrate users one by one without having to go to reconfigure the gateway or SPC every time. It also means that we actually don't really need to do any administrative complex changes on the phone system. And a lot of environments we go into, this is often a very aging platform. It's very expensive to maintain because they need to get in people to do changes to that. And, it may be just so old that they're just too scared to make a change to it because it will break. But this approach means that we can make this transition, and basically what we would do is as we move a user from here over to here, we put a call forward on that extension that forces the call to go back out here and allows the call to be redirected over this side. And through this, what we achieve is what we call dial plane integration between both platforms during that coexistence and migration period. And this could be weeks, months, or years. And in a large organization, it might take you years to actually finish this transition, depending on the investments you've got. So this is a very flexible option that we'd suggest considering. Ultimately, once you've decommissioned that old voice platform, you're left with this device here, and you may end up with an extra interface because of it was the one that used to be connected to the phone system. Another thing that's quite common is in here I've shown these connections as being ISDN, but what you can also do is midway through that process, you actually convert this side to SIP trunking as well. So we've seen that being done a few times. An alternative model was downstream gateway. So call comes in, it hits the PBX first. The PBX needs to figure out what to do with that call. So this means that we've got a lot more configuration changes on here, especially if you're doing one-by-one user migrations. You need to reconfigure this every time you want to move a user across. So this is a valid way to do it. We're just sitting on the back end or off the side of the phone system here. So again, it's a completely valid approach. It needs some more effort in configuring this PBX. And if you've got the skills to do that in-house, or it's not a hard thing to do, then that's going to be a valid way to go. And you would not end up with additional interfaces with this along the way, because this device might end up being lower cost because you don't need the extra interfaces for pass-through. Another approach is some voice platforms we can do a direct SIP trunk to. There's a link here, again, you can get from the decks when we download later on, but there's a number of platforms that we support a direct SIP integration, so there's no physical device in between. It's an IP connection between Skype for Business and the voice platform. Similar to the last slide, though, when we're looking at transition from one to the other, we still need to do quite a bit of configuration work here and support that change as well. So call via work is a new feature in Skype for Business that we talked about. In earlier versions, in Link 2013, I got it the other way around. In Link 2013, we had, and in previous versions, there's been a feature, in fact, it's been around since LCS, the very early days of this platform. We had a feature called remote call control. And really what that did is it communicated with the telephone system and sent commands to it to remote control your telephone, make phone ring this number, and make phone answer on speaker and that sort of thing. And one of the cool things it did, though, is it also fed your presence information, so it knew that when you're on a call, and it put that back into the platform, so it would update your presence. One of the challenges around that, though, is because it was inherently relying on this integration with a number of other voice platforms, it became quite a support challenge for organizations. And when the PBX version updates, you could have issues with that integration getting out of sync, and then the Link version updated, it could get out of sync as well. So it was used quite a lot, but there was a lot of integration challenges around that. So call via work kind of simplifies that in a lot of ways. And what it's doing, I'll show you in a diagram in a sec, is it's allowing you to use that existing device on your desk. In fact, you can use any telephone number to be able to initiate an outbound call. From a configuration point of view, this is what it looks like in the client. So at the bottom of the Skype for Business client, you get call forward settings. If you click on the more options, this is the new feature you'll see here. So for outgoing calls, put in this number here. So in that case, I've actually put in a mobile phone. So it doesn't actually have to be a PBX phone. You can give it any phone number as long as the Skype for Business server can initiate a call to it. As I said, this functionality replaces remote call control. So in the future, remote call control is effectively not really supported in future versions of the Skype for Business server. I think at the moment, if you look at the UI and stuff, it's kind of still there, but what we've been told is don't assume it will be there for much longer. So I think that's really to support people that are transitioning, so it's not a hard cut-off. Call via work is really an outbound experience, so it is actually revolves around these outbound calls. However, what we do is we use this in conjunction with simultaneous ring, which handles the inbound. So your SIM ring number can be that same number. So for incoming calls, they would also ring on my desk phone or my mobile if I wanted, or whatever other number you want to have. And for outbound calls, I'm telling it to connect that phone to the person I've called. Another difference with call via work compared to remote call control is with remote call control, you had to give up enterprise voice and the mobility that came with that. So if you were enabled in this RCC mode, you couldn't actually use Link, as it was before, as a telephone. You could only use it to remote control your telephone. So it was very difficult to get the best of both worlds, whereas call via work maintains enterprise voice and the mobility that's associated with that. So when you're not in the office controlling that phone, you can still use it to make calls as a software client or with the device you have attached to it. Let's have a look at how that works. So in this case, I'm going to show an outbound call scenario. So we've got your users down here, whether they're using the software client on the PC or have a device here. So that this would be really initiated from the software client, though, because it's where the click-to-call controls would be. So a user would type in a phone number into the client or initiate a call from one of the contacts in there. It sends a signal to the Skype for Business server. The server then initiates a call to your handset sitting on your desk, so your phone starts ringing, you pick it up, and then you hear a ringing for an outbound call. And what the server is doing is connecting you to that number that you've dialed. So think of it as like it's a sort of a bridged call to the person you're wanting to dial. You said, I want to call a person out in the PSTN. Skype for Business calls you and then connects you to that party. And because the server here is involved in that call, it will update your presence. So it knows that you're on a phone call even though you're using this telephone. And this scenario for the outbound call, because I've initiated it from here, it knows that you're on a call and will update your presence accordingly. There are some scenarios with call via work where your presence won't be updated. For example, if you just pick up that telephone handset that's still sitting on a desk and just dial the number normally, the Skype for Business server won't know about that because it's not involved in that call setup. So it's something just to keep in mind is that there are some scenarios where you'll get presence updated. There's some that may be where you won't get it updated depending on the scenario. For outbound call, this is, again, technically it's not call via work, it's really simultaneous ring, but just to show what that looks like. Incoming call comes in. We've directed it into the server because we've said that Skype is running our voice for this user. It basically forks the call then, so it would send the call down to your devices in Skype for Business. At the same time, it would send it back down to your telephone handset on your desk. And again, you can choose to answer from either, whichever one you pick up first, the other one stop ringing. So that call via work functionality we see again is a good sort of transition tool to be able to get maximum value out of things like I'm presence and the mini experiences and PSTN dial-in, but also get some utilization of that existing phone and voice platform that you have. And then hopefully gradually over time you can transition to native enterprise voice. One of the things that I think Val touched on is the idea of cloud enterprise voice. So you might have seen the dates there that Microsoft talks about for the full enterprise voice in the cloud. So it's coming in the US later this year. Initial functionality will be additional functionality added next year. And then after the US, they're going to roll out to Western Europe. And that's in 2016. So at some stage after that, it will come to Australia. So if you look at those timeframes that they're talking about, it's probably a good few years before we would see the full enterprise voice in the local data centers in Australia. And that the reason for those delays, just to give you some insight, is because Microsoft is becoming a regulated telco. There's a lot of regulations that have to go through, and they're all country specific. So Bill Vertine, who runs voice for Microsoft, talks about the team that he has. I think it's about 100 people. I think most of that team are actually accountants and lawyers that are working on getting voice in the cloud running because of all the regulation issues, and they've got to do it, reset every country they go to. So that's I guess some insight as to why it can take a while for this to happen. The technology is all there, and they're doing it now. It's all the legal and accounting issues and tax issues that come along with that will delay it. In the meantime, there is another option we've got where we can keep the PSTN bits on-premise but still have users homed in the cloud, and this is something that we will hopefully get later this year. There's not really any reason to delay that in our region, so we'd expect that it will be released in our region soon after the US, because the regulation issues don't apply because you're using normal phone lines, you're not using Microsoft to provide your phone lines. So how that works is your users would be in Office 365, so their conferencing and all their presence updates and user services live up in the Microsoft cloud. You do need a piece of Skype for Business infrastructure on-premise to be able to interface to that. The details of exactly what that is, we're still waiting for, but it'll be a server of some kind. So it works with your users in the on-premise environment, or they may be even out roaming on the internet. And it also works with the telephony infrastructure, whether it's a gateway, SBC, or the PBX you're doing direct SIP with, so that your calls and media actually still go out your own phone lines. So this is, we're trying to avoid the term hybrid because it's getting a very confusing term for depending on what you're talking about. But it's, cloud voice with on-premise connectivity. So this is something that we probably see as being a more reality in the near term in Australia for hybrid deployments. One of the considerations also about this transition to Skype for Business, and if you are looking at eventually decommissioning existing voice platforms, is what are you doing with some of these analog devices? So there's a couple of things to consider. Faxes is probably the most common one. In fact, who's got rid of faxes in their organisation completely? There's not enough hands. Okay. Inevitably, a lot of organisations still do have a dependency in there for some reason or another. My first advice to them is try to get rid of them if you can. Sometimes you can't. Other than that, try leveraging cloud services as for fax. So Telstra, as an example, has a fax stream enhanced service where you can use email to fax and fax to email to outsource all that fax stuff to someone else. So otherwise, you can deploy fax servers that can integrate with SIP trunks. And again, if you're doing it over SIP trunks, just check with your provider to make sure it's all going to work and it's compatible. But some other areas besides fax is things like FPOS terminals. Again, well, often in this case, a lot of people are moving to 3G or IP FPOS as well. So that's something, again, we would suggest. And we can support these analog devices, but it means deploying more infrastructure. We've got to convert these back to analog ports. And to do that, we have to deploy gateways. And if it's faxing or data services in particular, converting fax and data services back to analog over an IP network presents a few challenges, because if you get the slightest bit of loss or issue with that network connection, you'll find that your fax calls will fail or your FPOS won't be able to dial up. So it's something we try to avoid. It can be done, but it needs some careful planning. Another thing we see regularly is things like door phones and gate intercoms, public address systems. So again, as part of it, what I do is we find all these solutions so we can solve all these problems, and we've got options for you. So a few other things to think about. Contact center. Skype for Business has a bunch of functionality around call queuing and that sort of thing, but it wasn't designed to be a contact center, although it has a lot of those features. So if you have a full-on contact center with all the reporting that goes with that, consider talking to some of the partners outside about their solutions and how they integrate with Skype for Business. Things like voicemail menus and things. There's recordings that you may need to get from old systems and bring them across. Active Directory, often the phone numbers in Active Directory are not necessarily up to date, and Skype for Business will use them to populate its version of the directory it presents to users. So good idea to have a look at that and try to clean up and make that data in AD more accurate. Group policies, again, another thing we've said a few times is some older group policies that might have been there for earlier versions of OCS even that can actually affect some of your deployments. And sometimes we have some quality issues with soft clients and devices, and sometimes that's actually out-of-date drivers. Another thing just to watch out for. So just to wrap up, there's I guess 10 tips I just want to quickly suggest to finish up with this session. There's something called the Rollout and Adoption Success Kit. I've put a link to it down the bottom there. It's something that I suggest you, if you're deploying Skype for Business as the first time you're looking at the Microsoft UC platform, or even if you are trying to drive more adoption or upgrading, it's a great resource to start looking at and planning adoption and deployment. As part of that, engage your users early, so don't just sort of deploy this on the desktop one day without getting them involved and letting them know what's happening. If you are planning on doing voice and you're excited to get to there, we do suggest that it tends to be a little bit easier if people are familiar with the client and interacting with IM and presence before you just go bang it. It's also your phone and take away the old telephone potentially. So get them using the basic features, IM and presence and meetings first of all, and then probably add enterprise voice shortly after that. This could be still a short time frame, but it just eases that transition. Getting the devices right is really critical. This is something that some people sort of say, cool, I've got a soft phone now, just pick the cheapest headset and give them that. There's another session actually later, I think today, on devices. We'll talk about it. But the user perception and success of the project from a user point of view is largely dependent on that piece of software that you're giving them and the device that's associated with that. So the actual device you give them is going to make a big difference to how users are going to perceive the project you're doing. Make sure you understand what your phone system does today, just so we can capture all those things and provide the equivalent services. Don't necessarily try to deliver exactly the same way you did it before, because Skype for Business presents a lot of opportunity about using things like presence and changing the way you do workflows to do things different ways and that are much more productive. So don't get too tied up on specific PBX features necessarily. It certainly helps if we can give them there as a baseline as well for the transition, but take the opportunity to look at is there a better way to do it. Network readiness is a really critical thing as well. You're going to be having a lot more real-time media on your network, so you need to plan that carefully, and the best way to do that is to start with an assessment that you can get a partner to help you with. A lot of people see the mobile app and think, cool, I don't need to give people a telephone anymore. They can all use the mobile app. Technically, yeah, that's correct. We could do that. There are a few challenges around that, though. Two are battery life, for if you're going to use that as a communications device all day in current devices. And also the wireless networks as well, and the reliability and consistency of those. You can have a really good experience on these mobile devices, but whether you can have that every time in every place in every location you use it may not be the case. So the mobile app is a great companion device and for complementing probably another primary means of communication. As you do the transition as well, look out for those key users. So typically receptionists and PAs are very reliant on voice services, so you need to pay particular attention to their requirements and needs as you go through this transition. I want to, I guess, encourage you to deploy these, again, a hybrid deployment with Skype for Business. We saw a feature we talked about before, broadcast meetings. So I'm not sure if Val highlighted that, but that broadcast meetings, because it's using Azure services, actually requires a hybrid deployment of Skype for Business. So you need to have it integrated with Office 365 to be able to use that functionality. Also, that feature, broadcast meetings, is not quite here yet, by the way. It's coming later this year. But there's a number of scenarios where even if you can't move all your users to the cloud, you will get extra value and extra features available if you do have a hybrid deployment. So certainly encourage you to think about that. I've got another session later on around IT Pro Tools, so I'll cover this in a bit more detail, but there's a bunch of partner solutions out there that can help both the planning and deployment exercises, but help also a lot in the operations and support of running a Skype for Business environment. So I'm going to wrap it up there. And when you get the deck, there's going to be some extra resources. We've put some links to some of the videos from Ignite in Chicago. There's some great sessions in there. Rather than trying to re-deliver them, we'll suggest that you take a look at those.